In a lakeside town glowing with church bells and clean white porches, old people were starving behind smiling charity photos. A 28-year-old FBI agent came in secret with her German Shepherd to follow the missing meals. By midnight, her former Navy SEAL partner vanished after tracking a van no one was supposed to see. Only the dog kept dragging her toward the lighthouse, where a dying man and a buried truth waited in the dark. If you believe God still sends help before it is too late, leave amen. When Special Agent Ivy Rowan crossed into Silver Birch Harbor, the town looked too gentle to be carrying a secret. Morning sunlight lay over the lake like polished glass. White houses stood in neat rows above the shore. Birch trees trembled in a pale northern breeze, their leaves flashing silver green as if the whole town were whispering to itself. A little church steeple rose above the rooftops. An old marina leaned into the water with the weary dignity of something that had lasted longer than it should have. At first glance, it was the kind of place that made people lower their voices without knowing why. Ivy was 28, slim and straight-backed, with dark brown hair pinned into a practical knot that had partly loosened during the drive from Duluth. A few strands touched her cheek whenever the wind turned. Her face was fine-boned and serious, softened only by tired hazel eyes that noticed too much. People often mistook her calm for distance. It was not distance. It was discipline. 2 years earlier, she had made one fast decision in a fraud case down in Illinois, and the wrong man had walked free on a technical failure that still woke her before dawn. Since then, she trusted caution the way some people trusted prayer. She had learned that truth was not only found, it had to be carried carefully. Beside her sat Echo, her 5-year-old German Shepherd K9, large and deep-chested, with a sable coat so dark along the back it looked almost burned by shadow. His ears were sharp and upright, his amber-brown eyes steady and old-souled. Echo was not affectionate in a foolish way. He was composed, watchful, and almost gentlemanly with strangers, but when he fixed on something, he held to it with a devotion that made Ivy think of old legends and iron keys. He had been trained to track scent, locate missing persons, and assist on controlled searches. Yet there were moments when his instincts seemed to travel ahead of training into a quieter realm no manual could name. The case file waiting on Ivy's seat looked clean, polished, almost noble. Federal relief funds meant for elderly meal assistance after the pandemic had moved through the county without obvious cracks. The signatures matched, the budgets balanced. The smiling photographs from community events showed volunteers in matching aprons carrying trays into tidy kitchens. It should have been a simple compliance review. But numbers, Ivy had learned, could wear a Sunday face while hiding a weekday heart. Her temporary assignment placed her with a small joint task group already operating out of a converted municipal office near the courthouse. That was where she first met Caleb Ashford. He stood near the window with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, broad-shouldered and angular, a man built like a line cut into wood. He was in his mid-30s, with sun-browned skin, close-cropped sandy hair, and a short beard that followed the hard shape of his jaw. A pale scar crossed one side of his chin and disappeared into the beard like an old road under winter brush. Caleb had once served as a Navy SEAL and had since moved into federal tactical support work, carrying himself with the alert stillness of someone who never fully left the field. He was courteous but not easy. He listened fast, decided fast, and had the habit of looking at every room as if measuring exits before conversation. A teammate later mentioned, in a lowered voice, that Caleb had once lost a partner because a command decision came 30 seconds too late. Since then, delay and danger had become brothers in his mind. Their first exchange was clean and polite, but not warm. Caleb believed movement revealed truth. Ivy believed impatience ruined it. Between them sat a cardboard box filled with meal logs, donation letters, and transport sheets from the county's community table program. Outside, church bells rang the hour with almost insulting innocence. By noon, Ivy and Echo were walking through one of the storage warehouses listed in the county records. The place smelled of canned vegetables, cardboard dust, and industrial cleaner. Stacked shelves held dry goods, napkins, gloves, and packed meal trays marked for delivery. Everything looked right. That was what troubled Ivy most. Fraud, when done by amateurs, left disorder. This place had the polished stillness of something rehearsed. A county employee guided them through with a bright smile that never fully reached his eyes. Caleb moved ahead, scanning loading areas and delivery lanes. Ivy kept one hand lightly near Echo's harness. He passed sealed food pallets without interest. He ignored the refrigerated section. Then, halfway down the rear wall, he slowed. His body changed before he made a sound. His neck lowered. His nose lifted once, twice. He stepped to a freshly painted section of wall behind a rack of paper goods and stood still. A sharp bark split the warehouse air, and for one strange second, even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum more softly. The sound did not belong to panic. It belonged to certainty. Then the silence rushed back in, and every set of eyes turned. Echo pressed close to the wall and gave his trained alert. Caleb's head snapped toward Ivy. The county employee laughed too quickly and said the section had only been repaired after a plumbing leak. Ivy did not answer. She only looked at the paint. It was newer than the wall around it. The screws along the lower panel had been disturbed recently. Within minutes, a technical support officer removed the false panel. Behind it sat hidden banker boxes wrapped in plastic. Inside were delivery logs with duplicate names, signature sheets that repeated handwriting across different dates, medication notations with no linked recipients, and internal transfer memos that should never have been stored outside official accounting. Caleb let out one slow breath through his nose, the kind that meant his suspicion had just found a body. Ivy felt something colder. This was no paperwork error. Someone had built a stage set of kindness and tucked the truth behind painted wood. The rest of the afternoon became a quiet procession of conversations. Ivy and Echo visited several addresses listed in the records. At one small clapboard house with lace curtains and flower pots waiting for spring, an elderly woman invited them in. Her name was Mabel Jensen, and she was in her late 70s, tiny and soft-voiced, with thin white hair curled carefully at the temples and blue eyes that had gone watery, but not weak. Her hands shook when she poured tea, though whether from age or memory, Ivy could not tell. Mabel lived alone, and the rooms carried that lonely neatness old people keep when they hope someone might still visit. At first, she repeated the safe things. Yes, the county had helped. Yes, there had been volunteers. Yes, everyone was very kind. But when Echo laid his head gently against her knee, the old woman's fingers sank into his fur, and something inside her loosened. She looked toward the curtained window before speaking again. Her voice grew smaller, but truer. Some days, she said, a van had come only long enough for pictures. Once they set a tray in her lap, took smiling photographs, then carried the food away when they thought she had gone to the bathroom. There were weeks afterward when no one came at all. No hot meal, no medicine check, no knock at the door. Just the ticking clock and the kettle she kept reheating so the house would not feel abandoned. Ivy did not interrupt. Caleb, standing near the doorway, shifted his weight once, but said nothing. Mabel said there was more, something she had seen from her front window one evening near the harbor road, but she did not want to speak about it in daylight. She asked Ivy to return the next night after supper, when the street was quiet and the curtains in the neighbor's house were drawn. By the time Ivy stepped back outside, the sky had turned honey gold over the lake. Silver Birch Harbor seemed almost unfairly beautiful. Young mothers pushed strollers along the sidewalk. A pair of boys on bicycles laughed as they cut through church shadows. Somewhere a screen door slapped shut, followed by the sweet smell of bread warming in an oven. Ivy had seen this before in other towns, the strange marriage of tenderness and betrayal. Evil in many places did not wear fangs. It wore a clean porch, a community smile, and a hand over the heart. The next evening, Ivy returned to Mabel Jensen's house a few minutes before their agreed time. The front porch light was off. The lace curtain had been left slightly open. No answer came when she knocked. Echo moved first, not toward the door, but toward the steps. A small knit scarf lay crumpled by the threshold, pale blue with a frayed edge. Ivy's pulse tightened. Across the corner of the porch, the security camera had been turned upward, its lens partly covered, as if someone had wanted only a few minutes of darkness and no more. Echo lowered his nose to the scarf and inhaled. Then he lifted his head, turned slowly, and stared down the road leading toward the harbor, where the last light on the lake was already fading. The scarf in Echo's mouth was still warm from the porch light when Ivy Rowan turned toward the harbor road, and in that instant the peaceful beauty of Silver Birch Harbor seemed to shift, as if someone had taken a clean painting and tilted it just enough for the shadow underneath to show. The lake still held the last silver of evening. The white houses still stood quietly behind their little porches. But the town no longer felt harmless. It felt watchful. Ivy knelt beside Echo and let him breathe in the pale blue knit one more time. His ears stood forward, his sable coat darkening along the spine, his whole body gathered into purpose. He did not pull wildly. He moved with the grave patience of a creature that knew the difference between fear and truth. Ivy rose and called Caleb. He arrived in less than 10 minutes, wearing a charcoal field jacket over a dark thermal shirt, the cold reddening the edges of his scarred jaw. Caleb Ashford always looked as if he had stepped out of unfinished weather. Even at rest there was something tense and angled in him, like a bridge cable drawn tight. His beard had grown in rougher than the day before, and his pale blue eyes held the sleepless shine of a man who trusted motion more than comfort. 2 local support officers came with him, but Ivy kept the circle small and quiet. She did not want sirens. She did not want neighbors gathering in robes with questions. If Mabel Jensen had been taken to silence her, panic would only help the wrong people. Echo led them north, away from the church road and the tidy streets, into a part of town where the houses thinned, and the birch groves rose pale and slender over the dark earth. The wind smelled of cold leaves, lake water, and old wood. At the edge of a service lane behind the northern ridge, Echo stopped, circled once, and pressed his nose toward a sagging chain-link gate. Beyond it stood an abandoned greenhouse complex, its long glass roof panels clouded by age and streaked with mineral white. The place looked like a forgotten chapel built for plants instead of people. One section leaned badly, another had been boarded. Ivy's pulse slowed in the way it always did when the fear inside her turned useful. They moved carefully. Caleb checked the perimeter, one hand near his sidearm, the other lifting the latch with controlled gentleness. Inside, the greenhouse smelled of wet soil, rust, and the sweet rot of old vines. Broken benches sat under ghostly sheets of plastic. Ivy could hear the small clicking hum of a portable heater somewhere deeper in the structure, too new a sound for a place supposedly deserted. Echo gave one low alert and took them toward a rear potting room, where a temporary latch had been fitted to a wooden service door. Mabel Jensen was inside. She sat in a metal chair with a blanket over her knees, frightened but not harmed beyond exhaustion. Her thin white hair had slipped loose around her face, and the light from the hanging work lamp made her skin look almost translucent, like paper left too long in sun. When she saw Ivy, the old woman's mouth trembled before any words came. Echo went to her first, slow and gentle, placing his head against her hand until her fingers remembered how to close. That simple touch seemed to pull her back from whatever lonely cliff she had been standing on in her mind. Ivy crouched in front of her and spoke softly. Mabel said 2 women in medical jackets had come to her door after noon and told her there had been a health concern connected to meal deliveries. One of them had smelled strongly of roses and hand sanitizer. The other had a voice too cheerful to be kind. They brought her here just for a little while, they said, until someone could sort out the paperwork. Mabel had known something was wrong the moment they would not let her keep her own phone. But at her age, fear came in practical forms. She had worried less for herself than for the cost of making trouble. Back at the task office, Ivy set Mabel in a warm side room with tea and a county nurse from their support list, then took her statement formally. The nurse, Lena Morales, was in her 40s, compact and steady, with olive skin, dark hair in a thick braid, and the level hands of a woman who had seen too many frightened people to be rattled by one more. Lena had worked pandemic relief in Duluth and still carried the quiet fury of those years beneath her calm. She asked Mabel only what was needed, then sat back and let the old woman speak. Sometimes mercy looked like questions asked at the right speed. It was from Mabel that the name Victor Hale entered the room with full weight. He was not some hidden clerk or back-office thief. He was the county commissioner whose smiling face appeared on newsletters, banners, and charity luncheons across the district. In photographs, he was a broad man in his early 60s with silver hair combed neatly back, a handsome public face, and the relaxed posture of someone long accustomed to being thanked. He wore expensive navy suits with soft ties and gave the impression of a grandfather who could bless a room simply by entering it. That, Mabel said bitterly, was why people trusted him. He knew exactly how goodness should look from a distance. She described meal days when volunteers posed with trays in her kitchen, cameras flashing while she smiled, because smiling seemed easier than asking questions. Then the trays were carried out again. Once, from her front window at dusk, she had seen one of the meal vans stop by the Western Harbor Road and transfer sealed cartons into another vehicle with tinted windows. Caleb leaned both hands on the conference table and stared at the map as if willing it to confess faster. He wanted to move immediately on the Western Harbor route. Ivy did not. She needed federal fund transfers tied to physical movement, tied again to named decision-makers, or Victor Hale would float above the case like a saint in a church mural while everyone below him took the fall. Caleb's jaw hardened. Ivy's voice sharpened. The argument that followed was not really about one van. It was about the old wound each of them served in secret. Ivy still lived with the memory of the case she had pressed too early, the way it had collapsed and left justice embarrassed in the open. Caleb still lived with a partner he had not reached in time. Delay, to him, was not patience. It was loss walking toward you in boots. A metallic clink rang under the vehicle bay outside, sharp as a dropped coin in a church aisle, and then everything stopped for one breath. Echo's head snapped up before either of them moved. The silence after that sound felt alive. By the time they reached the SUV Ivy had been using, Echo was already down on one foreleg, nose under the frame, giving a focused alert. Caleb dropped to the pavement beside him and found the device taped behind the rear axle housing, a compact listening unit, good quality, clean placement, not the work of a fool. Ivy stared at it and felt the case draw closer around them like winter water. Someone knew where they were. Someone was listening to timing, names, maybe even fear. That discovery should have brought them together. Instead, it deepened Caleb's urgency. Later, after the others had gone to catalog evidence, he received a call on a secondary number he rarely used. The voice on the other end was low, male, and rushed. A transport was moving from the western docks before midnight. Real records, possibly cash, no second chance. The caller hung up. Caleb found Ivy in the hallway outside the records room. He did not ask permission. He only told her he was going to check a service corridor near the Western Harbor, leave a tracker if he could, get photographs, and be back before 1. She told him not to do it. He told her if the shipment moved, their beautiful chain of proof might be sailing across the lake before dawn. The look that passed between them held anger. Yes, but something sadder too. The knowledge that each understood exactly why the other would not bend. He did one thing right. On a slip of paper folded twice, then again, he left Ivy a short coded note with the sector number and probable route. He borrowed an unmarked local vehicle from Impound, one without federal GPS, and moved fast. When he stepped into the lot, Echo came from the shadows and stood directly in front of the driver's door. The dog did not bark. He simply looked up at Caleb with those deep amber eyes, steady and grave. For a flicker of a second, Caleb's face softened. He crouched and rubbed Echo between the ears. "Just a few minutes," he murmured, though the words sounded like something he wanted to believe, not something he knew. Then he rose, got in, and drove out into the cold northern dark. Ivy stood in the hallway light with the coded note in her hand as the taillights disappeared beyond the birch trunks. A moment later, Echo lifted his head toward the black road and let out a long, aching howl that seemed to pass over the lake and come back emptier than it had left. Caleb Ashford reached the western docks a little after 11, driving with the headlights low and his jaw set in that familiar hard line Ivy Rowan had already begun to recognize. The harbor at night looked nothing like the polished postcard face Silver Birch Harbor showed by day. The lake was a sheet of black glass, breathing cold into the shore. Empty slips knocked softly against their posts. A rusted chain-link fence ran beside the old loading yard, and beyond it stood a row of service sheds with warped doors and tired roofs, silvered by moonlight. Caleb parked the borrowed vehicle behind a stack of cracked lobster crates and moved on foot, broad and quiet in the dark, his field jacket zipped high against the wind. He had the kind of face trouble carved into men who had lived too long by instinct: square brow, scar along the chin, pale eyes that never fully rested. Once, in another country, he had waited for an order that came too late, and a teammate had not come home. That old failure still sat behind his ribs like a small cold stone. It was why waiting never felt noble to him. It only felt dangerous. He reached the fence line in time to see the transfer begin. A white meal delivery van rolled toward the back lot with its logo half covered in road dust. Two men in work jackets opened the rear doors and began moving sealed cartons, not toward the food coolers, but toward a narrow motor launch hidden in the reeds below the dock wall. Caleb crouched behind a broken utility box and raised his phone. He took the plates first, then the profile of the driver, then the face of a third man stepping from the shadows near the boat ramp. That third man was neatly dressed even at midnight, with dark hair combed close, a camel-colored overcoat, and the polished ease of someone who had never expected to be seen carrying secrets. Caleb knew him from county photos, Victor Hale's assistant. The sight of that face tightened everything. More boxes followed, and when one tipped under a careless hand, papers slid inside the cracked seal instead of food trays. Caleb got that too. He should have left then. But certainty is a greedy thing. It asks for one more second, one more angle, one more proof. The flashlight beam found him before he heard the footsteps. A harsh white blade cut across the fence and struck the side of his face. Someone shouted. Caleb ran. He moved along the fence line with the quick, hard economy of a man whose body remembered survival before thought could catch up. Gravel slid beneath his boots. A heavy shape came at him near the gate, and he turned just enough to avoid the worst of the collision, but a metal rod glanced off his shoulder and sent a hot burst of pain down his arm. Another figure reached for him through the wire brake. Caleb drove forward, twisted free, and vaulted a low retaining wall that dropped toward the drainage ditch. He landed badly. Pain opened along his ribs like a bright tearing seam. His radio flew from his belt, struck the concrete lip, and vanished into the dark meltwater below with a small swallowing splash. Behind him, one of the men cursed. Another told the others to leave him, as if they trusted the cold to finish what fear had started. Caleb kept going. The western harbor had too many blind spots for comfort and too many dead cameras for mercy. Half the municipal system had gone down in the last storm, and the signal there broke apart around the old boatyard because of the ridge and the steel storage sheds. He knew if he aimed for the road, someone might see him. If he aimed for town, He might lead danger straight toward the people Ivy was trying to protect. So he went lakeward instead, following the black edge of the shoreline where reeds hissed in the wind and broken boards shifted under his weight. A gull burst screaming from the dock pilings, white wings flashing across his face like torn paper in moonlight, and Caleb stopped for one impossible heartbeat, dizzy, breathless, listening to the wild beating of those wings vanish into the dark. Then the pain came back, and so did the cold, and he moved again. Far ahead, beyond the fringe of birch and rock, the lighthouse rose against the sky in a pale column. At its base crouched the old rescue boathouse, long abandoned, its doors salt-stained and warped by 100 winters. Caleb forced himself toward it. Inside, the place smelled of rope, oil, wet wood, and forgotten storms. A rack of ancient life-preservers hung on one wall. A cracked weather chart still clung to a board near the window. He shut the side door behind him, braced his shaking hand on a workbench, and tried to breathe through the pain. Blood had soaked through the side of his shirt, warm at first, then chilling fast. He pulled out the memory card from his phone, crossed to the wall, and shoved it deep into the seam of an old life ring hanging from an iron hook. It was a small choice, almost foolishly simple, but it felt right. Then the room tilted. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the moonlight slipping through the window in a pale square on the floor. At dawn, Ivy Rowan knew something had gone wrong before she allowed herself to say it aloud. Caleb had not checked in. The coded note he had left her felt heavier in her pocket than paper should. Outside the temporary office, morning came clear and beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel. The lake shone like hammered silver. Church bells rang across town. Echo stood by the door before she called for him, already alert, already waiting. Ivy clipped on his working harness with steady hands, though her heart was not steady at all. They started at the western docks. Ivy found the borrowed vehicle hidden where Caleb had left it. Echo found what people missed. Near the drainage edge, a torn piece of radio cord clung to frozen grass. He smelled it, then pulled her toward a broken section of fence. From there, he picked up the sharp trace of dried blood on a weathered piling. Beyond that came something fainter and stranger, wet canvas, lake mud, and old engine oil braided together by the wind. He tracked not in a straight line, but in thoughtful arcs, testing the air, returning to ground scent, then lifting his head again, as if reading a language written across water. Ivy followed without hurrying him. She trusted him more than panic. The lighthouse appeared through the birches like a pale ghost with its mind still on duty. Echo did not hesitate. He bounded toward the rescue boathouse and struck the door with both front paws, barking now with a force that shattered the morning stillness. Ivy forced the latch and stepped inside. Caleb lay near the workbench, half on his side, skin chilled, lips drained of color, his breathing so faint she had to kneel close to hear it. Fear moved through Ivy like ice, clean and merciless, but training caught it before it could own her. She checked his airway, pressed a hand to the wound, wrapped him in an old wool rescue blanket she found in a cabinet, and spoke his name in a low, steady voice. Echo pressed himself along Caleb's back and ribs, giving up his own warmth without command, his dark eyes fixed on the man's face as if refusing to let him drift away. By the time the support team arrived, Caleb had not fully woken, but he had answered once with the smallest movement of his hand. Echo did not follow the others immediately when they brought in the stretcher. Instead, he turned sharply and barked toward the wall of old rescue gear. Ivy looked where he was looking and saw the life ring, one edge slightly disturbed. Inside the worn seam, her fingers found the memory card Caleb had hidden with the last of his strength. An hour later, seated in the front of an idling county vehicle while paramedics worked in the back, Ivy watched the recovered footage on a tablet. The meal delivery van appeared first, then the cartons, then the hand-to-hand movement of envelopes thick enough to bow at the corners. The route marker in the background pointed not toward a charity depot, but toward the northern ridge where Victor Hale's glass estate overlooked the lake like a crown that had learned how to smile. In one blurred frame, a familiar face from county government turned toward the camera for half a second before moving out of view. Ivy stared at that frame until the image seemed to pulse. This was no longer a local fraud dressed in clean paperwork. It was larger, colder, and closer to power than she had allowed herself to believe. Caleb Ashford spent the next 3 days in the regional hospital between the lake and the highway, in a room that smelled of clean linen, antiseptic, and the faint metallic breath of machines. The danger passed slowly, almost grudgingly. He came back to consciousness in fragments: white ceiling, winter light on the window, Echo's dark shape near the bed, Ivy Rowan's voice moving low and steady through the room like something built to hold. Caleb looked worse awake than he had unconscious, which somehow made him seem more human. His face had lost color, his beard had grown uneven over the angles of his jaw, and the pale scar on his chin stood out sharply against the hollow fatigue in his skin. Yet his eyes, when fully open, were clear again. They held shame first, then gratitude, then the familiar impatience of a man whose body had been forced to admit it was mortal. He could not do field work, not yet. The doctor had made that plain, but he could identify faces from the footage, mark route patterns on maps, and reconstruct the likely rhythm of the late-night transfers. For the first time since Ivy had met him, his instincts were being asked to sit still and serve something slower than action. The tension between Ivy and Caleb had not vanished, but it had changed its shape. It no longer felt like flint against steel. It felt more like two tools finally learning they had been made for the same difficult labor. Ivy visited every morning with folders tucked under one arm and coffee gone lukewarm in her hand. She remained slim and composed, her dark hair pinned back, her hazel eyes carrying that same fine-boned seriousness, but some guarded edge in her had softened after the boathouse. Saving Caleb's life had forced her to stop seeing him as a hazard inside the case. He was not simply a reckless man with field instincts. He was a wounded one trying, in his flawed way, to keep loss from happening again. Echo, meanwhile, had taken up a station beside Caleb's bed with the quiet resolve of an old sentry. The 5-year-old German shepherd seemed to understand convalescence better than most people. He lay long and watchful on the floor, sable coat spread like a dark cloak, ears lifting at every footstep in the hallway, eyes never fully drifting shut. Nurses began greeting him by name. One of them taped a paper badge to the counter that read K9 Consultant, and even Ivy smiled at that. By the time the search warrant came through, the weather had brightened. Silver Birch Harbor looked almost unfair in its beauty, all clear light and tender wind, as if the town were trying to persuade itself that goodness still lived in visible things. The abandoned greenhouse on the north slope crouched beneath Victor Hale's ridge like a forgotten servant, half hidden behind young spruce and silver birch trunks. Ivy led the search team there just after noon. Lena Morales came with them, practical as ever in her dark county jacket, her thick braid tucked down her back, her steady face set in the calm of a woman who had learned during the pandemic that truth often arrived after comfort had already left the room. Mabel Jensen also came later under careful supervision, not to endure the full search, but to help identify photographs if anything relevant surfaced. Her tiny frame looked almost swallowed by her wool coat, yet her blue eyes were firmer now. Fear had bent her. It had not erased her. Inside, the greenhouse held the stale perfume of damp wood, old fertilizer, and broken seasons. Sunlight entered in long, pale bands through the clouded glass roof. Dust drifted where tomato vines had once climbed. Human hands had clearly been here more recently than the county records admitted. Some benches were too clean. One lock had been changed. But where the others searched drawers, cabinets, and utility shelves, Echo moved differently. He passed the office desk. He ignored the steel cabinet. He walked to a square of old plank flooring where potted orchids might once have stood and froze. His head lowered, his nose brushed the seams between the boards. Then he stepped back and gave one sharp, certain alert. Ivy knelt. The wood there had been lifted before. When the team pried the section open, a hidden compartment revealed itself beneath the floor. Inside lay the cold little heart of the lie. There was a blue-covered ledger marked only with dates and initials, lists of meal recipients who had never received their meals, staged photography plans with notes about lighting and volunteer placement, and receipts for repairs and luxury purchases tied to the Ridge estate, the private dock, and furnishings no public relief program had any reason to touch. There were invoices for imported stone, custom glass panels, and marina carpentry sitting beside the names of elderly residents who had been recorded as receiving daily support. It was not just fraud. It was theft performed in a language of civic kindness. Ivy held one page longer than the others. On it, a column of meal deliveries matched almost perfectly with press appearances and donor luncheons. Someone had not merely taken money. Someone had learned how to turn loneliness into decoration. A violent hiss burst from the rear wall, followed by the hard metallic chatter of water lines kicking alive, and for one stunned second the greenhouse seemed to inhale. Then Echo spun toward the back exit and exploded into barking, every muscle in his body lit with warning. A man in a maintenance jacket bolted from behind the irrigation controls, one hand slick with chemical residue from the open tank beside him. He was maybe 40, narrow-faced, with a receding hairline, wind-chapped cheeks, and the strained, over-alert look of someone who had lived too long as another man's obedient shadow. He nearly made the door. Nearly. Echo cut him off with terrifying speed, not attacking, but blocking the path so cleanly and fiercely that the man stumbled backward just as two agents took him down. Water had begun to spit from the overhead lines, mixed with a cleaning compound strong enough to ruin paper and damage electronics if given time. But Echo's warning had come early enough. The team shut the system down before the records were lost. Ivy stood still for a moment afterward, listening to the last drops tick from the pipes into metal trays. The truth had almost been washed away in front of them. Later that afternoon, under Lena's gentle supervision, Mabel Jensen reviewed the recovered photographs. Her hands trembled once, then went still. In one image, there she was in her own kitchen, smiling in a cardigan the color of faded roses, a sealed meal tray resting in her lap like a promise. She touched the picture with one finger and said in a voice so quiet the room leaned toward it that the tray had been taken back out after the cameras left. The sentence changed the emotional weight of the case more than any ledger ever could. Caleb, listening by phone from his hospital bed, said nothing for a long time. Ivy looked down at the blue ledger again and understood that the case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer only about money, signatures, and false reporting. It was about the deliberate use of elderly grief, elderly trust, and elderly hunger as stage dressing for power. Near evening, as the evidence team boxed the last recovered materials, Ivy turned the pages of the ledger one final time. Halfway through, tucked between payment shorthand and transport notations, she found a line written more plainly than the rest. Move all real records before Gala night. The words sat on the page with chilling composure, as if the writer had never once imagined being judged by them. Ivy closed the cover slowly. Gala night was only days away, and it would take place at Victor Hale's glass estate on the ridge above the lake. Outside, the late light turned the greenhouse windows gold. Inside, the air felt colder than it had all day. Ivy looked at Echo, then at the boxed ledger in her hands, and knew with painful clarity that if they missed that night, the last living links of the case might vanish like breath on winter glass. By the time Gala night arrived, Silver Birch Harbor looked dressed for mercy. Lanterns glowed along the winding drive up Victor Hale's ridge. The lake below held the last blue of evening like a polished mirror, and the glass walls of Hale's estate caught the sunset in warm sheets of gold. From the road, the place seemed less like a house than a promise. High windows, trimmed stone, white columns, and gardens trained into graceful obedience. Soft jazz floated from the terrace. Men in dark suits and women in silk and wool moved through the entry hall with careful smiles and lowered voices. Donors, local reporters, county officials, and hand-picked community guests had all gathered for what Victor Hale called the Evening of Gratitude. A few elderly residents sat in the front row near the stage, their clothing neat and old-fashioned, their hands folded in their laps as if they had come not to be seen, but because they had been told it would be rude not to. Victor Hale stood among them like a polished heir to public virtue, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, his face handsome in a practiced way, his voice warm enough to soothe a room before it had reason to doubt him. He wore a dark midnight suit and a pale blue tie, and he moved with the easy assurance of a man long accustomed to applause. Inside the estate, the FBI operation moved like a second current under bright water. Ivy Rowan wore a fitted black coat over a simple dress, the kind of clothing that helped her disappear in elegant spaces without seeming out of place. Her dark hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head, her fine-boned face calm, her hazel eyes taking in everything. The servers' routes, the guard placements, the side corridors, the tiny tensions people revealed when they believed no one important was watching. She had never liked these polished gatherings. They reminded her too much of how easily power learned to smell like fresh flowers and expensive candles. Echo moved beside her at the outer edge of the service grounds, working in quiet harness, his dark sable coat nearly black under the string lights, his ears alert, his gait measured and controlled. He was not part of the spectacle. He was part of the truth. Caleb Ashford had returned, though only in a restricted support role. He wore a dark suit poorly, as if tailored fabric had no right to sit on a man built for field jackets and hard weather. His shoulder was still stiff beneath the cloth, and a faint strain showed in the line of his mouth when he turned too quickly, but his mind was clear. Through a discreet earpiece, he coordinated from a utility corridor overlooking the lower drive, identifying faces, tracking movement, and helping lock down exit routes without stepping into direct confrontation. His pale eyes missed very little now. Pain had slowed his body, but it had sharpened his patience. Victor Hale began his speech just after 8. He spoke of gratitude, service, and the duty of a community to care for its elders. The audience listened with softened faces. A woman from the local paper dabbed her eyes. A donor couple in matching silver hair nodded along. Ivy stood near the side garden and felt a strange heaviness rise in her chest, not from fear, but from the cruelty of how beautiful a lie could look when dressed in chandeliers. Then Echo changed. It began in the smallest way. A stillness, a tightening through the shoulders, a slow turn of the head toward the rear service path that led down toward the private dock road. He drew in the air once, then again, and looked up at Ivy with that grave, deliberate intensity she had learned never to ignore. She touched her earpiece. Caleb answered at once. "What is it?" She kept her voice low. "He's got something." They moved away from the terrace, past trimmed hedges and a row of empty catering carts parked beneath heat lamps. A server came through the side door carrying a silver tray and nearly walked into them. He was new to Ivy's eye, mid-30s, medium height, with slick dark hair, a narrow face, and the over-careful posture of a man pretending not to notice the weight in his own pockets. His white jacket fit badly across the shoulders. There was a dampness at the cuff, and when Echo came close, his nostrils flared at a scent older than wine and kitchen steam, wet leather, lake salt, old paper, and machine oil. The same braided smell Caleb had described from the western docks. The man stepped back too quickly. His tray tipped, and crystal glasses rang against one another like small bells of warning. One glass slipped free, struck the stone, and shattered with a bright, clean crack that cut through the music and froze the moment in a spray of glittering light. For one breath, no one moved. Echo's head lifted. The man's hand twitched toward his coat. Then time returned. "Stop right there," Ivy said, and something in her voice made pretense useless. The man bolted toward the descending path, but Caleb was already moving from the corridor door above, not fast, not recklessly, just exactly where he needed to be. He intercepted from the side while Echo cut off the lower turn, blocking the man's flight with a fierce, silent authority that sent him stumbling backward into Ivy's reach. When agents searched him, they found a sealed envelope thick with cash, a compact backup hard drive, and a brass key marked with a cellar number not listed on the house plans. Caleb's breathing had gone shallow from the effort, but he only nodded once at Ivy, as if saying this was the part they had always been meant to do together. The key opened a narrow service entrance beneath the east wing. Down a short stone stair, the air grew cooler and richer, full of oak, cork, and the expensive stillness of stored wine. The cellar was elegant in the way all hidden things owned by powerful men seemed to be. Rows of bottles lay in perfect order. Soft amber lights glowed behind wooden racks. But Echo ignored the room's beauty completely. He led Ivy past the tasting table and stopped before a section of shelving near the back wall. He pressed his nose to one carved panel and looked at her. Caleb, now leaning slightly from the pain in his side, found the recessed hinge first. The shelf swung inward. Behind it lay a narrow chamber lined with document cases and archival boxes. Inside were photo packets from staged community events, contracts routed through shell vendors, lists of elderly residents flagged as camera-friendly, and audio files backed up on labeled drives. In one folder, Ivy found smiling images of old women and old men holding meal trays they had never been allowed to keep. The cruelty of it made her hands go cold. In another box, she found vendor agreements linking the relief accounts to dock repairs, imported stone, and private estate upgrades. And then there was the recording. Victor Hale's voice came through the speaker smooth and unhurried, speaking to someone just off mic about fund transfers, press timing, and the need to keep public sympathy warm. There was no confusion in his tone, no innocent surprise, no hint that he misunderstood where the money had gone. When agents moved upstairs to make the arrest, the grand room seemed to shrink around the sound of it. No one screamed. No one had to. The music died. Chairs scraped. A few of the elderly guests simply stared at Victor Hale, as if a house they had trusted had suddenly turned to glass and shown them the winter inside it. Ivy remained below for one final second, listening to the last part of the recording. The line came softly, almost conversationally, and that made it worse. "If the FBI gets too close, let the town turn on them first." Ivy closed her eyes only once before opening them again. That sentence meant Victor Hale hadn't merely hired couriers and frightened assistants. Someone inside the local fabric, someone trusted, someone placed close, was still working for him. The arrest above them was real, necessary, but it was not the end. Not yet. The case did not end on the night Victor Hale was led away beneath his own chandeliers. It widened, deepened, and then settled over Silver Birch Harbor like a long winter, finally naming every tree it had touched. In the weeks that followed, the Gala became only the bright, terrible doorway through which the rest of the truth walked in. Men who had moved boxes in silence began to speak when faced with ledgers and recordings. A woman from the county outreach office, small and careful in manner, with tired auburn hair and a face lined too early by anxious years, admitted she had helped choose which elderly residents looked best in photographs. A dock contractor with raw knuckles and a smoker's cough confessed that repair invoices for Victor Hale's private property had been folded into community relief claims. Federal money was traced, property freezes were filed, shell vendors were peeled apart one by one, and the false charity network that had wrapped itself around the town in the language of kindness began to fall to pieces. Ivy Rowan did not celebrate. She had seen too many cases where victory looked clean in the papers and left a mess in the hearts of the people who had lived inside it. For her, the work that mattered most began after the cameras went home. She went house to house with folders, explanations, and patience. She sat in kitchens that smelled of tea, old wood, and the faint sweetness of kept memories. She listened more than she spoke. At Mabel Jensen's small clapboard house, she explained the court filings slowly, one page at a time, while morning light rested on the lace curtains and made the room look softer than grief deserved. Mabel, still tiny and bird-boned, with careful white curls and blue eyes that had seen betrayal without surrendering to it, held the warm mug Ivy poured her and said she had thought the worst part was hunger. Then she admitted the deeper pain had been believing no one would ever come back and tell the truth plainly. Ivy understood that. She had spent much of her life trusting order more than comfort, and now she was learning that justice had to be spoken in a human voice, or it remained only a document. Echo became part of that healing in a way no formal plan could have designed. The 5-year-old German shepherd had always carried himself like a quiet officer, alert, sable coat, dark along the spine, amber eyes steady with old-soul patience. But in the months after the trial began, the town saw another side of him. He lay by the door of the rebuilt meal kitchen in the parish hall each afternoon, as if guarding the return of decency itself. He followed the first delivery van down Church Street and along the birch-lined roads, stepping beside volunteers with a composure that made people smile before they realized they were smiling. Elderly hands reached to stroke the fur between his ears. Children whispered his name with reverence, usually reserved for heroes in old stories. He accepted all of it with the same grave humility, as if praise were beside the point. The point was that the meals were real now. Hot soup, fresh bread, fruit packed by human hands that meant it. Knocks on doors that were followed by care instead of cameras. Caleb Ashford healed more slowly than his pride liked, but more deeply than he expected. By late autumn, he had regained his strength, though pain still caught at his side, when the weather turned sharp and the wind came off the lake with a hard edge. He no longer fought stillness the way he once had. Something in him had changed beneath the scar tissue. The old reflex to carry danger alone had begun to loosen. He still woke early, still mapped rooms with his eyes, still moved like a man who had known too many bad seconds. Yet now, when he sat across from Ivy at the task office with coffee between them and files spread under the yellow pool of a desk lamp, there was less iron in him and more warmth. He had learned that being saved did not make a man smaller. It only made him honest about what he could not survive without. Ivy changed too, though she would never have used the word aloud. She remained careful, precise, and disciplined. Her dark hair was still usually pinned back, her fine-boned face still composed, her hazel eyes still sharp enough to see the hairline crack in any official story. But she no longer hid behind caution the way she once had. She had come to Silver Birch Harbor fearing that one wrong move could break a case. She left understanding that building truth also required tenderness, the courage to stand in a kitchen, meet sorrow without flinching, and say, "I know what was taken. I am here anyway." Winter passed, then spring, and the town slowly learned how to live in a lighter way. The church hall kitchen became the heart of that new rhythm. Mrs. Lorraine Bell, the volunteer coordinator, kept it running with cheerful severity. She was a broad-hipped woman in her early 60s with cinnamon-brown skin, silver-threaded braids coiled at the nape of her neck, and a voice rich as warm bread. She had lost her husband during the long pandemic years and had turned that grief into a discipline of service so steady it made other people stand straighter around her. She scolded late volunteers, hugged crying widowers, and believed soup should always have enough herbs to remind the soul it had not been forgotten. Under her eye, the hall glowed each afternoon with steam, clattering pans, and the small, holy business of care. One bright June evening, as the last tray lid snapped shut and the church bell rang across the lake, Echo lifted his head toward the open hall doors, and a soft gust of warm air carried in the smell of cut grass, lilacs, and water touched by sunset. Everything paused for a heartbeat, the voices, the dishes, even sorrow itself, as if the town had suddenly heard its own life returning. By the following summer, when the legal storm had long since moved into transcripts and final orders, Ivy and Caleb had become something neither of them had tried to force, and neither could honestly deny. It grew in quiet ways, in mornings spent walking the lakeshore before work, with Echo pacing ahead through silver grass, in long evenings reviewing testimony side by side until one of them noticed the other had gone still from simple peace rather than exhaustion. In those small domestic silences that feel, to lonely people, like a door opening where there had only ever been wall. Caleb stopped measuring every future in terms of risk. Ivy stopped measuring every tenderness in terms of damage. Between them, love arrived not as thunder, but as steady weather. Their wedding took place 1 year after the Gala, in early summer, near the old lighthouse where Caleb had once been found, between this world and the next. The grass around the bluff moved softly in the wind. The lake shone bright and kind. There were no grand decorations, only white chairs, wildflowers in mason jars, and a few people who had earned the right to witness the moment. Echo wore a deep blue ribbon at his collar and carried the rings with solemn dignity, as though he understood that he was not merely participating in a ceremony, but closing a circle fate had begun on a colder night. When Ivy smiled at Caleb beneath the open northern sky, there was nothing dramatic in it, only truth, only arrival. That evening, after the guests had gone and the light turned honey-soft over Silver Birch Harbor, the last meal van of the day stopped before a small house with 2 pots of yellow chrysanthemums on the porch. An elderly woman opened the door, received a hot supper in both hands, and looked up at the sky with the fragile, grateful smile of someone who had waited longer than she should have had to wait. Echo sat quietly beside the porch steps. Caleb stood with one hand wrapped around Ivy's, and the breeze off the lake moved through the birches with a hush that sounded almost like blessing. The town that had once hidden its darkness behind bright windows now shone for a simpler reason. At last, something honest had returned to every door it reached. At the end of this story, the truth is simple and powerful. Goodness is not proven by speeches, titles, or beautiful appearances. It is proven by what we do for the lonely, the hungry, the frightened, and the forgotten. A warm meal placed in trembling hands, a promise kept, a door opened at the right moment, a life protected when no one else is looking. These are the quiet things that reveal the true measure of a human heart. This story also reminds us that animals are not beneath our love. They are often among heaven's gentlest messengers. A faithful dog may not speak with human words, yet love, loyalty, courage, and warning can shine through watchful eyes, a steady presence, and a heart that never turns away. Sometimes an animal sees pain before people do. Sometimes an animal stays when the world has already walked on. And sometimes, through that faithful love, a broken soul finds the strength to stand again. To care for an animal is not a small kindness. It is a holy kind of responsibility. There are moments in life that feel too precise, too merciful, too beautifully timed to be called mere coincidence. A rescue in the cold, a truth uncovered just before it vanished. A wounded man found before morning came too late. A town given one more chance to become honest. Many people would call these things luck. But perhaps they are something softer and greater. Perhaps they are the fingerprints of God left quietly on ordinary days. Perhaps miracles do not always arrive with thunder. Perhaps they come through faithful work, brave hearts, open hands, and the unwavering devotion of a dog who refuses to leave. In daily life, most people will never face a grand conspiracy or stand beneath courtroom lights. But every person is given smaller choices that matter just as much. We can speak gently to those who are tired. We can visit someone who lives alone. We can feed the hungry, protect the weak, tell the truth when lying would be easier, and treat animals with tenderness instead of indifference. We can choose patience over cruelty, honesty over comfort, and compassion over pride. That is how a better world is built, not all at once, but one faithful act at a time. So let this story be more than a tale. Let it be a reminder to live with a cleaner heart, to love more deeply, to notice who is being overlooked, and to honor the lives of animals who give us loyalty without asking for much in return. Hold your loved ones close. Be kinder than necessary. Feed what is hungry, comfort what is trembling, and do not be ashamed to believe that light still reaches dark places. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a moment when an animal changed your life. And if you believe stories of faith, courage, and second chances still matter, please subscribe to the channel so more hearts can be reached. May God bless every person watching, every home represented here, every lonely soul in need of comfort, and every animal waiting to be loved. May the Lord place peace in your home, strength in your spirit, healing in your memories, and gentle protection over everyone you hold dear. Amen.